Good evening and welcome to the third of the New Arabs webinar series. We're very lucky to have two exceptional speakers with us today to look at one of the GCC's most pressing and disturbing events since its inception, the blockade of Qatar. Just a quick word for those of you new to the New Arab. We were established 6 years ago by Professor Azmi Bishara, one of the Arab world's leading intellectuals and liberal Democrats, with the aim of becoming the most professional outlet covering the region in the most objective manner possible. We're obviously always open to suggestions, criticisms, contributions from everyone. And if you visit our website, which is currently being revamped and will be launched soon, relaunched, it's newarab.co.uk. With us today is Professor Kristian Coates Ulrichsen, who is a fellow for the Middle East at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, as well as an associate fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. He's the author of 7 books, including 5 on the Gulf, the most recent being Qatar and the Gulf Crisis, published by Hurst in February 2020. Reem Al-Harami is a researcher and columnist. She was a fellow at Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University in New York. She's published articles in both Arabic and English in several international newspapers and websites. Her interests are focused on issues such as media and social media, counterterrorism, feminism and women's issues, and international and US politics. Of course, it goes without saying that both of them have a significant social media presence and are very Twitter active. Myself being a keen follower of them both, they're both very, very useful to follow indeed. A quick background as well to those of you who have joined this webinar and might not have a fuller picture about the Qatar blockade. Of course, our guests will be talking more about this as well. The blockade happened under an interesting pretext of posts which were put on the Qatar news agency by hackers. After 13 days of a huge media onslaught by the countries involved, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, on the 5th of June 2017, all borders between Saudi Arabia, land, air, sea, and as well land, air, sea with, I mean, there's no land borders with the other countries, but the air and sea borders as well were blocked to them by Bahrain and the UAE as well. And a list of demands not dissimilar to the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum were given. The demands included some very controversial, let's call them for now, demands, many of them which were obviously touched, were directly contravening to the national sovereignty of Qatar as the sovereign state. Some were also questionable because they asked for Qatar to hand over people that were either dead or actually lived in the blockading countries. And many other things that I think we will touch on. Within the webinar, I hope that we will leave the webinar with a greater understanding as well as to why the blockade on Qatar is actually important and should concern the international community, the impact that this whole blockade has had on the freedom of speech and freedom of expression in the region, in the GCC, and possibly even the wider Arab region. State interference, heightened state interference in media to a whole new level. Brazenly aggressive behavior has possibly become the norm, I think, within states. And also the idea about how this has kind of like signaled a new wave of what some might describe as a neo-authoritarianism in the region. Far less accountability than before, far more authoritarianism than before, and quite possibly the complete destruction of whatever was left of the Arab Spring and the hope that a lot of other people had in the wider region. Anyway, I'd like to begin with Reem, if I may. And Reem, maybe you could begin by giving our guests an introduction to the blockade and the impact it had on media and social media, and what were the main issues that we can take from the first year or two of the blockade.
Right. Good evening, and thank you for having me. So just like reiterate what you just said, Abdurrahman, every crisis has a pretext. The pretext for the GCC crisis and the blockade of Qatar was hacking Qatar News Agency and attributing comments allegedly made by His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, which never took place or he never said. So after that, and this is something that might sometimes be forgotten to be mentioned in the media, the Director General of the Qatar News Agency contacted his counterparts to tell them that the website has been hacked, that those comments were false, and none of them were true. However, he got no response from them, and this is when we started to doubt that there was something going on. The fact that they never responded to his texts and and never pulled out the comments meant that this is only willingly, the comments were willingly put there, and they have known about this whole thing. And then the other thing is that when Sky News Arabia and other Saudi and UAE news outlets rushed to publish the comments without fact checking them, without having any Qatari, commentators, if you will, they rushed to bring in commentators from their respective countries and elsewhere to comment on the alleged comments made by His Highness, which he never said again. And then, they had experts, around the clock, basically talking about, the comments, the false comments, and not a single Qatari voice were on those media outlets. And it's very interesting also when we look at this crisis, that when they initiated the blockade and when Qatar News Media was hacked, Qatar News Agency, sorry, was hacked, they never had any demands. They never had any kind of allegations, if you will. It's only when the US spokesperson, Heather Nauert at the time, said that they were mystified at the actions taken by the blockading countries, and that they said, the State Department said back then, that the more time goes on, the more doubt is raised about the actions taken about the blockading countries. And this is to tell you how irrational their actions were and still to this day. So basically, when the Saudi and Emirati, basically the blockading countries have published such information, false allegations about Qatar, they knew, that they have taken the green light from, unfortunately, the leadership there. So on June 5th, there was that blockade. On June 20th, the US State Department made that statement that there has been no demands. They don't know what the blockading countries want. And then on June 23rd, only 3 days after the State Department statement, they had the 13 demands, which were, basically nonsense. They were just, it's just nonsense what they came up with. So ever since then, they have used so many tactics on whether social media or traditional media. One of the very, first thing that they have done is that they pushed to mobilize tribes against Qatar. So basically, you know how interconnected families and tribes are here in this region. They tried that to ultimately lead to regime change in Qatar by mobilizing the tribes. But it backfired at them because it always showed loyalty and solidarity and allegiance to the leadership here in Qatar. And when we talk about mobilizing tribes, it's like we're back to the dark ages era again. It's unfortunate that we've seen the blockading countries using such tactic in order to basically achieve some sort of regime change that they were hoping to have. Another thing we need to also focus on is the language, especially the Arabic text in the media. So the language is crucial here when it comes to the GCC crisis and the blockade of Qatar. You would see often words that I have never seen in any political or diplomatic dispute in anywhere in the world. For example, they have repeatedly called Qatar the prodigal child or the disobedient child or son. meaning that Qatar is no longer under the Saudi hegemony and they need to come back to the Saudi hegemony. This is a word that has been repeatedly said in Arabic in their located countries' media. Another, alarming thing, and it's used as a psychological war tactic used by the blockading countries, is they repeatedly have spoken about starvation and a famine in Qatar. So we all know that the blockade took place during Ramadan, the fasted month of Ramadan, where the consumption of food and water goes up to maybe 200%. And the 90% of the food and other supplies came from the blockading countries. Qatar imported 90% of their needs from these blockading countries. And when the blockade happened and the borders basically border was closed by land, air, and sea, there was a lot of, let's say, gloating on social media and elsewhere that Qatar might fall into a famine, that the Qataris might be starving. And there are lots of media individuals from both countries have been circulating photos of empty shelves at Qatari supermarkets and in grocery stores, and commenting, in a way that is honestly very alarming, to see that rhetoric and language online. They were talking all the time about, the starvation, and Qatar might need to import food, but they can't, and, all sorts of things like that. So that was one tactic to kind of a psychological war, if you will. Another thing that is very, I think, not spoken about a lot is the continuous vicious attack on women. Basically, any woman who speaks up, any woman who is not in line with the rhetoric of the blockading states, she's under a very vicious attack online. There's lots of defamation, lots of slander, and lots of character assassination. The language that they use against women are very sexist, very misogynist, and it continues to this very day that women find themselves in a very toxic environment online and elsewhere also on traditional media, but particularly online, when they are continuously attacked and continuously slandered just for speaking up. And this kind of behavior is not spoken about enough, unfortunately, but I think we should emphasize on, the continuous attack and the on women who speaks up, which is aiming to coerce women and to silence women from continuing to speak up, to continuing to articulate themselves. So this is a very, alarming moment in the Gulf that I have personally have not seen before. We have not seen such thing in the whole Middle East. I think it's a very unique aspect of this GCC crisis, as unfortunately, the loss of ethics and morals when it comes to a political and diplomatic dispute, as they claim. So again, about the social media, we have seen continuous media campaign against Qatar that is aiming to initiate a military coup, for example, against Qatar. There are lots of circulated news that are untrue, of course, and obviously, about military coup happening in Qatar. Just recently, less than a month ago, they came up with a video that is not taken from Qatar, and they circulated this hashtag on Twitter saying that there is a military coup happening in Qatar, which is untrue and unfounded information. I think one of the most noticeable thing in this crisis is there's this sense of hyper nationalism that it's like, if you attack Qatar more, then you're gonna prove that you're patriotic, that you're gonna prove that you're, you stick to your country, which is something very also alarming in this region. I know there is a sense of nationalism all over the world right now, but the hyper nationalism on online, on social media, is something that we should really look at and pay attention to. In fact, when we talk about the social media, it's not only Twitter bots, it's not only random accounts. We have verified accounts for real people, real individuals. Some of them have held and continue to hold, titles close to the government. For example, the Dubai former police chief, and who's a lieutenant general, basically, he tweeted, for example, one time he tweeted Within 24 hours, he tweeted more than 50 times against Qatar. This same guy has tweeted a few days ago about the invasion, like a proposed invasion of Qatar, basically, a proposed Arab invasion, he called it, an Arab invasion of Qatar. I mean, you know, for someone who holds a security and police title to go on and talk about an invasion of another country, and this tweet continues to be on, and this guy continues to tweet the way he tweets, is really alarming. You know, it tells you a lot about unfortunately, the leadership of countries where these threats continue to happen, where these threats continue to take place against not only, you know, Qatar, but also the people of Qatar, the citizens of Qatar. You know, the irony here, Abdurrahman, is that on June 7th, the UAE public prosecutor, and this is published in a UAE newspaper, so no one can deny this, the UAE public prosecutor criminalized anyone sympathizing with Qatar or any objection to UAE stance on Qatar. And he even said there will be a fine of 500,000 UAE dirhams, that's equivalent of like maybe 1,250 US dollars, or and 3 to 15 years in jail for those who sympathize with Qatar. And this is, you know, this is to tell you, this is on June 7th. This is to tell you that there is a real suppression of opinions and views and freedom of speech. On the contrary, though, you know, the government communication office in Qatar here has issued a statement, you know, saying that everyone should stick to morals and ethics when they're using the social media. Everyone should refrain from using abusive language. And this is to tell you unfortunately, the difference of leadership, where, you know, people in one country have the green light and the go ahead to attack, you know, women and to slander people and to continue this abusive behavior, where another country, you know, discourages from doing this through its institutions, and which is something that is really unfortunate, and we have not seen in any other, you know, crisis or any other, you know, country. And unfortunately, it's something that is new to this region. So luckily, you know, when we talk about Twitter and the abusive behavior online, luckily there has been a recent action by Twitter. Just last April, Twitter took down about 7,000 Twitter accounts that are linked to UAE, Saudi, and Egypt, which is a good start, honestly, to curb on the abusive behavior online. But it's not enough. There should be more things done to stop this abusive behavior. And I think, you know, this abusive behavior would not stop unless the governments of these countries intervene, the highest person in the leadership intervene to put an end to this. Just like how they, you know, intervene to come up with a law to punish and criminalize those sympathizing with Qatar, they can also come up with a law to stop this behavior online. And then the other thing is that, you know, one of the most absurd things that I have seen recently is the latest columns by UAE and Saudi writers who have, you know, said and claimed that Qatar is behind the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, how irrational that is. Like, one of the writers said basically that Qatar is behind the coronavirus pandemic. And the reason for that is they want to damage the 2030 MBS vision, and they want to damage the Dubai Expo that's coming up soon. So, I mean, we're talking about the level of irrationality and the level of the kind of rhetoric that is being used and continues to be used. And my question, I guess, you know, if this is a diplomatic and you know, political dispute and political crisis, why do they have to bring in all the layers from society? Like, why do they have to bring in actors, singers, academics, you know, even Muslim clerics? The Grand Mufti of Saudi, he had an interview a few days after a few months rather after the blockade, said that the blockade on Qatar has so much good for Qataris. So you have even the Grand Mufti is intervening into this. You know, the problem is that the blockading countries. Yes.
Okay, I'll have to cut you out.
I'm gonna wrap up.
Last sentence, please.
Yeah. The blockading country have lost credibility, basically, and they really have to work hard on restoring this credibility.
Okay, thank you very much, Reem. I'm sure we'll revisit some of these points in a bit. Professor Kristian, it would be great, obviously, to leave you to your own devices, so to speak, to talk about the impact this has had on the political landscape in the GCC, given that we were used to the intra-GCC relations being somewhat benign. If there were issues, you know, they were kind of dealt with behind closed doors, indirect messages, and so on. This has been a full-on blockade. The media has become very aggressive. Political statements from very senior political figures have been very undiplomatic, let's say, or very straightforward, very harsh sometimes. So please go ahead.
Well, thank you. I would have thought that Mohammed bin Salman should be thanking coronavirus because it gives him an excuse when Vision 2030 doesn't work out the way he thought it would. I mean, he can now say this is an unanticipated development, and so, I mean, you have thought that actually it might work out better for him if it turns out that they don't change to the extent that he thinks it will change. Anyway, building on what Reem was saying about the blockade and about some of the legacies, I mean, I guess from an outsider's perspective, someone who's not in the Gulf, why is this important? Why is the blockade important? Why should people in the US or in the UK, but especially in the US, why should they care about it? Well, for a start, this is the biggest crack in the region, in the Gulf, since 1990, since the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Obviously, we didn't see a military escalation in this 2017 crisis, although we know from the Emir of Kuwait's comments in his White House press conference in September 2017, we know that there was some sort of escalation being planned. At least he said, thanks God, we stopped military action. But it's certainly the biggest crack in the Gulf for 30 years. It's also by timing, it was a coincidence of timing, that the blockade happened on the 50th anniversary, 50 years to the day, since the 1967 war, since the Israeli attack on Egypt, the beginning of the Six-Day War. And the 1967 war really reshaped the politics of the Middle East for a generation. And at least on a smaller level in the Middle East, in the sort of sub-regional level of the Gulf, we're seeing how, once again, politics are being reshaped, and it could well be for a long period of time. It's been 3 years now, but in 2019, for example, the Saudi ambassador to the United Kingdom, Prince Khalid bin Bandar Al Saud, he was asked at a think tank event, he was asked about how long it would take, the blockade, and his response was to draw an analogy with the US and Cuba, which of course has been ongoing now for more than 50 years. So certainly, we're in this for a longer period of time, and I think we've all had to get used to the Gulf rift as the new normal, and to some extent to how to figure it out, workarounds around it. It's also important because it's an international crisis of the alternative facts era. And I think we all remember those first 6 months of 2017 when Donald Trump came to office, even the very first weekend when there was the big controversy about the size of the crowd at his inauguration in Washington, D.C. And his advisor, Kellyanne Conway, coined the term alternative facts, which really then became a sort of kind of a synonym for the sort of very different narratives that people now seem to inhabit. And of course, the Qatar crisis began with alternative facts. It began with a hack, as Reem has said, and it began with a sort of fake news, a fake news story. This is an international crisis manifestation of that fake news, alternative facts issue, but it's also one from an international point of view that once you've let the sort of cat out of the bag, you've opened a Pandora's box that cannot be shut again. It's now 3 years in, and although Donald Trump initially seemed to support the blockade, he then changed his position, but he can't get the blockade to finish. He now realizes that he has much less ability to end it, even though at the beginning in 2017, it was perhaps the implicit assumption in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that he might support it, that arguably sort of drove the desire to take action when they did. It was also right after Trump had gone to Riyadh for his first overseas visit as president. So it's much harder to end this than perhaps it was to begin. So it's important in that respect. It's also important because it was a crack in the US-led kind of regional hegemony. The US has, for the last 30 years, had extremely close political and security relationships with all 6 Gulf Cooperation Council states. It still does. But now there's a huge gaping hole within that network of partnerships. And in 2017, there was a hope, I think, from the Saudis and the Emiratis that Trump would take sides. But this isn't this isn't like a Saudi Arabia versus Iran issue, where for the US there's one good side and one bad side. From a US perspective, these are all partners, and any assumption that they would take sides was at least short-lived. At the same time, the fact that Trump did initially tweet on the 6th of June, 3 tweets in support of the blockade, saying that Qatar was a funder of terrorism at the highest level, and it was good to see his talk in Riyadh paying off with the local partners. You know, that caused shockwaves. I mean, that caused shockwaves in Qatar, but I would argue it probably caused shockwaves in Kuwait, in Oman, and even if they thought about it, in Bahrain and the UAE as well. For 30 years, the US had been seen as the external guarantor of regional security, of these countries' stability. You know, the lesson was of Kuwait in 1990. If something happened, it would be the US that would step in, either to stop it from escalating, or then stepping in to fix whatever had happened. And so for the first time since 1990, that kind of assumption was tested. The assumption that the US might not always be at our support, that something might happen, the US might change sides. Now, obviously, the Qataris then worked very rigorously and successfully to make sure that the whole of US government did not join the White House in initially choosing to take sides, and that even the White House subsequently kind of rebalanced its approach. But the shockwave was still there, the fact that what might happen if you're ever in a position where your kind of most important external partner might not be there for you. And I would argue that for Qatar, that moment is in 2017. For the Saudis and for the Emiratis, I would argue they had a similar moment in 2019, in September, when we had the attack on Abqaiq and Hurst in Saudi Arabia, the missile and drone attack, which took out half of Saudi Arabia's oil production. And the Trump administration did nothing. And I would argue that a lot of de-escalation vis-a-vis Iran, and to some extent in Yemen, since September 2019 has been because the Saudis and Emiratis also, for them, realized that actually there might not be as close a relationship that they could trust with the US government, at least this White House, that they had thought. So for Qatar, that moment was 2017. For the Saudis and Emiratis, that time was in 2019. Now, what we've seen over the past, I guess, 8 months since September, and especially the past 4 months since January, February, with coronavirus, I think we've seen how stuck this crisis is, how stuck the blockade is. In 2019, in September, the attack on Saudi should have woken people up in the Gulf to the real nature of the threat that they face. You know, whatever disagreement with Qatar, the threat that Saudi Arabia faces physically is not from Doha. It's from Iran, or it's from groups linked to Iran, and that was shown. And the Qataris took part in a chief of staff's meeting. Soon afterwards, they agreed to a communique that reaffirmed the pledge of collective security. An attack on one, the GCC is an attack on all. They did all the right things. And there seemed to be progress in at least a dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. But then, of course, that lost steam. That eventually lost steam in December and kind of ground to a halt in January 2020. And it seems that a lot of the momentum from the Saudi side came to a halt in late November and December, after Mohammed bin Salman spent 4 days in Abu Dhabi with Mohammed bin Zayed. So it seems that if the Qataris had hoped they could kind of split the blockade by peeling Saudi Arabia away, it seems that MBS and MBZ still have a close enough relationship that over Qatar they will not split. They may split over Yemen, where they do support very different sides. But it seems that over Qatar, they will, at least for the moment, sort of be on the same page. So even with a threat, a common threat they saw in September, even that has not been able to end the blockade. And I'll just end by saying that even since March, a common challenge posed by the pandemic, which doesn't respect geopolitical boundaries, even in that phase of the pandemic, that hasn't brought the crisis to an end either. You know, we've seen tit for tat, we've seen the Bahrainis picking a fight with Qatar on Twitter on the Qataris trying to repatriate Bahraini citizens. We've seen, as Reem has said, these allegations that the Qataris are behind the corona. We've seen this continual, just continuing as before, like a business as usual. Even this hasn't been able to end it. And so if not this, then what? And I will just finally say that if Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi, if Mohammed bin Zayed is willing to pick up the telephone and speak to Bashar al-Assad in Syria about COVID-19 and to talk about the common challenge that they both face, you know, if he's willing to do that with the Syrian president after everything that's happened in Syria, but he's not willing to do that with Qatar, then I think we really are stuck. And I think people in the US, in the UK, or people outside have to realize this is probably going to take a long time to eventually resolve. So with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Well, thank you very much. That was great. And I think it was particularly pertinent, of course, the point about him talking to Bashar al-Assad. Of course, a lot of direct state media outlets and indirectly controlled state media outlets from the blockading countries have now begun describing Qatar as farther away from them than the state of Israel, for example, which was obviously the country which they would never want to admit publicly to have any relationships with, and so on. So maybe that will go some way to explain the current public animosity. We've got a great question from one of our audience who is basically saying that the GCC was already weakened as a regional organization before the Qatar blockade. If, as Dr. Ulrichsen suggests, the standoff is going to last for many years, is the GCC effectively dead? And I'd also like to add to that, Professor. Okay, let's assume that it will continue for many years. How do you see the landscape now? Obviously, that one GCC country has left OPEC, Qatar, obviously, and then the GCC might possibly be dead. Either it will just become a useless institution, or maybe even more people will leave, maybe Kuwait or Oman, more likely. Will alternative regional groupings happen, something solidifying even more the relationship between some of these countries, or what?
Well, I think as long as the Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Sabah, is still alive and active in regional politics, the GCC will continue. And I think it was very much Sheikh Sabah's initiatives in 2017 that kept the GCC together, functioning at a lower level, you know, not at a political level, but at least at a technocratic level. And you know, he also pushed very hard to have a summit that year in Kuwait. And of course, the summit then broke down in acrimony after, I think, one session in the morning. It showed the depth of the crisis. But I think as long as the Emir of Kuwait is still with us, because he's one of the fathers of the GCC as the foreign minister at the time, and he places great importance to it, and because he's the oldest statesman of the Gulf, he's the eldest ruler, I think there's enough deference, even still in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, that as long as he is still with us, the GCC will obviously survive. I know they've continued to meet in technocratic committees. I don't think it will regain its importance as a collective for the 6 head of states to come together in the same way that it did. And again, partly because when you talked about regional groupings, what might emerge? Well, to some extent, we've already had it. We had the Saudi Emirati Coordination Council, which was announced at the end of 2017. It's been meeting twice a year since 2018. And this is, to some extent, is the new kind of center of Gulf politics running from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi. It's arguably, it's as exclusionary as the GCC was inclusionary. You know, it doesn't even include Bahrain, which is one of the 3 Gulf states which are part of the blockade. So, I mean, we've already had a new regional alignment. And so whether or not the GCC then just continues, perhaps less visible than before, it probably will. I mean, I think we've seen in the past in the region, things don't necessarily get wound up, they just become more marginal. And I think maybe that might happen once Emir of Kuwait passes away. I mean, Oman also, I think, would be independent in policy, but of course, Oman, as we know, has a lot of financial difficulties and could at some point need Gulf support from their neighbors. I think we saw a story today from Bloomberg that said that might happen. So, I mean, Oman, I think, is in a very difficult position, but certainly the Kuwaiti issue could be important.
I would like to go to Reem, if I may, as well. We're going to be shifting, apologies to all of our audiences, from media to politics and back and forth like this, but it's great to have both of our guests here, actually, who are specialists in these respective fields. What will the impact be on relations within families that share, obviously, citizenship, from one country to another, or the popular culture that has been hijacked by this? So, for example, there was the Doha song where kids' voices were singing quite sinister lyrics about, Qatar and its emir and his family, and kind of like conspiracy theories about being controlled by Iran and so on. There was obviously the campaign to dig a huge trench between Qatar and Saudi Arabia to divide it, and so on. So these are things that I think might stay in, or will they stay in the memory of people? Will this cause issues? Have they caused issues within families or in society as a whole? Could you give us some insight into this, Reem?
Yes, unfortunately, the GCC crisis and the blockade of Qatar has caused a great damage to the social fabric within the GCC and the interconnected families in the GCC. One of the things is that, people and families were separated as a result of this blockade right away. People can no longer visit their families, and it's hard to visit one another's families. And I don't know, honestly, if people can let go of the damage that has been done to their families as a result of this blockade. The thing is, when we look at the GCC crisis and say we compare it to another, diplomatic crisis, I have never seen anything, in the recent history between any two countries who have, disputes or, even a war where they stop, the citizens of countries visiting each other, which is basically what has happened from the blockading countries. They separated families. They kicked out Qataris when they were in Mecca. They kicked out students who were studying in the universities over there. So there are sets of, actions that they have taken against people, and they have harmed, foremost, the most important thing, they have harmed families and the social fabric in the society. I don't know if people will let go of this easily. It's hard, but then the unity and the family ties between the Gulf countries, the citizens of the Gulf countries, are very strong, despite of the politics, unfortunately, of the blockading countries.
All of a sudden, I just realized we've got far more questions than we might possibly have time. I know Dr. Kristian has to rush off at 7 on the dot to another webinar, in fact. So what I'll do is I'll try and merge some of these questions. Professor, as Qatar has had to establish alternative suppliers, notably Turkey and Iran, does this represent a permanent change in economic relations in the region? As well, that was from a Stephen Bell and from Noura Al-Manai. There have been recent comments about a resolution to the crisis. What has been halting this resolution? So, as you know, there was a number of cases. In fact, at one point, there was a telephone call, obviously, between Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, and Doha. Then, in the space of a few hours, the whole thing was, down the pan, so to speak. So, could you address those two very quickly so that we can squeeze in a few more questions as well?
Yeah, sure. Well, in terms of restructuring trade routes, I mean, the Qataris have they put in place an infrastructure which is going to help and why would they need to go back to what they had in the past? I mean, I think the importance of Hamad Port, for example, of allowing Qatar to receive direct ocean-going cargo ships without having to go through Jebel Ali in Dubai was enormous. I think that allowed Qatar to bypass the UAE and deal directly with suppliers. And I would go as far as argue that had the blockade happened in 2014, when there was a previous row between the same countries in Doha, had that happened then, with 85% of Qatar's seabound cargo had to go to Jebel Ali first, the Qataris would have been in real difficulty very quickly. So, I mean, a lot of the infrastructure development and the logistics that they put in place are not just, I mean, they're a response to the blockade, but they're also laying the foundation for long-term restructuring, which, if it makes more sense, then I think they'll continue with that. And just in terms of the ending of the rumors about the ending of the blockade, I mean, we saw, I think, a series of messages at the end of May, beginning of June, between Oman and Kuwait and Qatar, and then the Emir of Kuwait sending a letter to the Saudi king as well. It didn't produce a result. We had the anniversary on the 5th of June. And I think what was actually also quite interesting was that the UAE was nowhere to be mentioned. I mean, these were messages involving the Saudis, it seemed, not the Emiratis. And I think the problem is that just as the crisis seems to have begun in Abu Dhabi, it will only end when Abu Dhabi decides it's ready to climb down. And I just don't see them being at that point, either now or anytime soon. So I think that's, as long as they're not involved in diplomacy, I just don't think we have a real chance of seeing a result.
Sorry, I'm getting used to the mute button. For Reem and yourself thereon, I'm also, again, merging a few questions here, but we're looking at quite a blockade where the blockading countries have really dug themselves in deep. And it looks like it's going to be a rather significant climb down of some sort if some rapprochement is going to happen. So how do you see a possible way out of this? Who could be the possible credible brokers? What might be the things that each side will have to do, possibly without losing face in front of their own people? I mean, some serious actions have been taken by countries imprisoning hundreds and hundreds of people who were supposedly sympathetic to Qatar, who tweeted, things like this. A lot of things have happened. So, Reem, maybe you could possibly give us your vision of that. I mean, bear in mind as well, again, as one of the questioners have said, is that whilst this blockade has happened, there has been a couple of times, and Professor Kristian mentioned this, where the Qatari military chiefs, for example, have taken part in a number of events as well, even whilst the blockade has happened. In the military practice, I think once or twice. So you've got this very strange situation. There's a very heightened tensions. What might be a possible way out here, and who might the credible broker be in this case? Please go ahead, Reem.
All right, so Qatar has been always committed to the Kuwaiti initiative, and Kuwait has been, initiating and hosting certain talks to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, the blockading countries have not, had any exit strategy out of this. Now, Qatar is open for dialogue. Qatar has been always said that they're open for dialogue as long as this does not touch the sovereignty and the independence of the Qatari foreign policy. Qatar welcomed dialogue several times from the early days of the blockade. Qatar said repeatedly that we want to have a dialogue, we're open for a dialogue, but there was unfortunately no response from the other side. Another thing is that Qatar is very committed to the unity of the GCC, right? That's why His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, right after the blockade started on December of 2017, he went personally to Kuwait to participate in the GCC summit in December 2017. Qatar has been committed to all of the GCC meetings. Qatar participated in the ministerial meetings on so many levels. Qatar was on February, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia did not grant Her Excellency, the Minister of Health, an entry permit to Saudi Arabia to attend the coronavirus summit, the GCC summit on the coronavirus. At first, they did not grant her entry to attend the summit, but then Qatar was committed also to attend the summit, just like any other GCC meetings. So the commitment from Qatar has been always, proven. However, unfortunately, the other blockading countries have not been as committed to the unity of the GCC countries. They have not been as committed to the meetings, and I don't think they're serious about any sort of, resolution out of this, because, like we said all the time, every time we move one step ahead, we get pulled back, because of, the collapse of the talks, like the recent talks between Qatar and Saudi, where Saudi has changed their mind apparently for unknown reason. And they started after that a media campaign again against Qatar. So like I said earlier, Qatar has been always committed to the GCC and the unity of the GCC, and it has proven on so many times, on so many occasions. What we are out to see is the commitment from the blockading countries if they're serious about mending this crisis.
Professor Ulrichsen.
Yeah, I think looking at it from a US perspective, I think Donald Trump had it the wrong way around. I mean, Donald Trump in spring 2018 had this plan to have separate meetings at the White House with Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, and then with Sheikh Tamim, and then have a sort of big grand summit at Camp David. But I mean, that's not going to be how the crisis is resolved, because it would involve losing face. It would involve leaders having to make acknowledgement that they may have made mistakes. And I think if this is resolved, eventually it will be quietly, it will be discreetly, it might be on issue-specific areas. It might not all be all at once, it might be incremental. I just don't think, the sort of idea for a huge Camp David style reconciliation meeting was ever going to take root. Now, I think obviously we saw then Mohammed bin Zayed refused even to go to the US to talk about it. And so, I mean, for that respect, I'm not surprised that the mediation, at least from the US side, didn't produce results. At least from the Kuwaiti side, Emir Sabah is obviously steeped in the history, the culture of the GCC and of the region. And I think he has much more of a chance to make progress. But of course, he's also, I think he turns 91 next week, so he won't he won't be with us forever. But certainly from the US side, I think they had it the wrong way around, the way they were trying to resolve it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We one of the things that also came apparent during the fallout was the fact that there is obviously no effective arbitration system within the region. When the blockade happened, Qatar went to the ICC, and there was a ruling about the blockade and so on. In terms of the implementation of it, Reem, has there been any implementation allowing families who have cross-border relatives to go back to Qatar or vice versa, anything like that? Have any of the court's recommendations or rulings been implemented?
Well, after the court ruling, UAE had no option but to allow, those who want to visit families and allow those who want to go back to the universities to go back to school. So it took, a long time for this to be implemented, but, there are some obstacles, but they finally came to implement this court rulings.
Okay. So and this is another issue as well. In the future, will there be, or do you think there is potential for some kind of arbitration system within the region, Professor? Do you think something like this will happen, given that it's unsustainable really to always pin your hopes on the most elderly sheikh in the region?
Well, I mean, ironically, the GCC does have a settlement dispute mechanism within the GCC, but that wasn't used in 2017. And in fact, at every stage of the crisis, the GCC was marginalized. The GCC was not used as the vehicle to express whatever grievances the three other states in the GCC may have had against Qatar. The GCC wasn't used in terms of a settlement dispute mechanism, and the GCC then wasn't used in the attempts to mediate. It was the Kuwaiti emir by himself and supported by the US on occasion. So that's the problem. At every stage, the GCC, which could have played a role, didn't play a role. And so, I mean, I don't know where the GCC goes from there.
I think, and finally, there's the pressing issue of the impact of the blockade now. And by the blockade, I mean the entire thing, everything that happened in between and all of the actions taken by the blockading states on their own citizens. There has been a huge impact, a clampdown on freedom of expression, for example, within Saudi Arabia, within the UAE. Both countries prior to the blockade and possibly prior to the Arab Spring even were experiencing some laxing, some freedoms within their local media and so on. All of these have basically disappeared. And we've had activists, civil rights activists, politicians, academics, NGO workers, all put in jail under various pretexts. Now, what will happen to the future of civil life in these countries in the 5, 10, 15, 20 years? I mean, is it right to believe that it looks very, very bleak or not? Professor, or rather, Reem, please go ahead, and then we'll please.
Go ahead, Reem.
So I think, without a genuine leadership, well, this, cannot be happened. They cannot grant freedom of speech unless there is a strong will from the leadership itself. As long as people are allowed to express their views without any fear or consequences, whether legal or jail, or, like what happened to Khashoggi, dismembered and killed, without guarantees from the top of the leadership in the Gulf and in the blockading countries specifically, we can never have, any sort of freedom of speech and, freedom of expression, in the GCC. So I think that they need to have a very strong will in order for that to happen.
Professor.
Well, yeah, I think you're right to say it's getting worse in both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and also in Bahrain too, actually. And I mean, this is a problem in the sense that obviously you can rule through coercion, but it's not necessarily the most sustainable form of rule. At some point, you're going to need consent. And I think especially as we now may be moving into a much more difficult economic period when there might be economic and even social frustration because of the pandemic, the lockdowns and the impacts, you can either rule by force alone, which of course they've tried to do, but it's not, I don't see how that is a long-term solution. And my concern is, for example, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia has really pitched himself as the only man who can change Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's his kind of whole legitimacy that only he can kind of pull it off. But what happens if he can't? What happens if he fails? And then what happens if he's under pressure and then decides to crack down?
Well, the greater question as well is what price does development if it comes at the cost of civil rights and civil liberties?
Well, exactly. So, I mean, these are all bigger problems for the Saudis, Emiratis to have to face, I think, especially for the Saudis in the next 2, 3, 5 years. And of course, for countries like Qatar or for Kuwait or the Oman, even for the UAE, I mean, they all know that they can't change their geography. I mean, whatever happens in Saudi will have an impact on them. And I mean, I think the whole Abu Dhabi's whole argument is that we have to support Mohammed bin Salman because only he can change Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, they're also concerned about it. But of course, the problem then is what happens if he fails? And how do you then limit, the implosion or limit the damage that might be done? And I think for all countries in the Gulf, this is going to be a concern over the next 5 to 10 years. I have to live with this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, thank you both very much. I can't thank you enough for giving us an hour of your time. I know both of you are extremely busy. I'm sure all of our attendees benefited greatly from your input. I hope